so let's get right into it. We have some amazing panelists here. We have Adam Rothstein and Olivia Rosane, both of whom write for The State and have written some amazing stuff about drones that's really inspired me personally. We have James Bridle, who's an artist and writer and also has done a lot of work with drones, specifically some really amazing visual art that deals with drones. And we have Eleanor Saitta, who is also an artist and writer and deals a lot with technology and society in general. So let's go ahead and get right into it. Let me pull up my notes, which I closed because I'm not smart. Okay, so just to kind of get into this in a little bit of a general way, one of the things that is consistently part of the conversation on drones is ethics, obviously, the ethics and morals of this kind of technology. And given that this specific form of drone is kind of, or at least this specific category of forms of drone is relatively new, drones themselves actually aren't all that new. How do we deal with the ethics involved? How do we approach new technology in a way that is ethical, especially us as people who don't have a whole lot of political power and may or may not have very much in the way of a voice?
Okay, well, I will go ahead and start. So drones are interesting, I think, because of their capacity to be a sort of analogy for how we approach new tech. As Sarah was saying when she outlined like the question that drones are both old and new, and this is something I've been doing research on and kind of reviewing the way that drones developed as part of the military-industrial complex as a weapon, and sort of comparing that to other sorts of larger technological revolutions, things like the car, things like the airplane in general. And you know, these are all technologies that seem as if they're going to be changing the world. This is something that there was kind of a, for the automobile, there was kind of a consensus that this was going to be a big thing, but nobody knew exactly how big and how the car was going to change society. And nobody could have predicted what we have now, the sort of car culture that we have and how it's changed our urban environments. Drones are similar, I think, and they provide a good bellwether, a good moment for us to stop and reflect and sort of consider history and how we consider a technology to be part of history, both in its development and its use, and how different technological features of the drone kind of become this symbol. They get this label that sort of makes them unique, even though the technology that's in a drone, it's an aircraft, it's global positioning system technology, it's imaging technology, it's military weapon technology. None of this is unique to the drone. It all existed outside of the drone, but it kind of came together in this one moment that is both scary and also alluring in its own sense. So I think I will pass on the mic now, but that's where I start in terms of trying to view the drone as a moment that we can sort of consider ethics of technology in a way that we may not be as reflective of in a sort of everyday basis.
Okay, hello. I quite want to talk about this photo since Adam's thrown it up on the screen as a good starting point. But just to echo what he said, I think, is that right, sound-wise? Is that, for me, I hate these things. Let's be really clear about that. And when we're having this discussion around these drone objects, but we're not interested in the object. I don't want to talk about the machine. They're the kind of charismatic megafauna of the network, essentially. They're like these big, obvious things that we can all group around and have a conversation, but they're just the pointy bit at the end of a huge, invisible system. That allows us to kind of look in and talk about this thing. And this image is for me this kind of insanely good example of this. This image is pretty much the most widely circulated image of a drone. You won't have to look very far on the internet or even in print to find it. And that's because it's the first Google image search result for the word drone. If once you've noticed it, you start noticing it everywhere. So I've seen it in newspapers here in the UK and abroad. I've seen it on kind of campaigning websites. I've seen it on people's blogs. I even saw it last week. Someone sent it to me in an official US Air Force technical report about the future of UAVs. And the thing about this image is it's not real. It's entirely fabricated. It's a 3D model of a drone that someone created in a 3D processing thing and Photoshop a few years ago. It's not a photograph. the most widely circulated image of this technology is itself an entire kind of technological construction. It doesn't exist. And that for me kind of stands in for our frequent and difficult inability to talk kind of meaningfully about these technologies, because we lack, in large part, the kind of metaphors that we need to talk about them with. We're really, really bad at coming up with kind of substantive, useful metaphors for invisible technologies. And this word invisible gets overused a little bit, certainly by me. But what I largely mean is the kind of the intangible, and the stuff that's hard to approach, the stuff that's hard to draw pictures of, not the drone, but the command and control system behind it, the satellite links, these kind of incredibly disparate geographies of sites of attack and sites of launching and development and control. And any time there's a drone operation going on, just a standard military drone operation, there's probably 4 or 5 different, not even people, but like locations full of people linked into the stream from that drone and kind of command and controlling them spread around the world. So it's this kind of embodiment of the networks that we use every day, and that's where I get really interested in these things. Because when we're trying to describe the drone, we're really trying to describe the outline of the entire contemporary world, of everything that we live in. It's just one kind of really good and powerful access point to do that from.
All right, so I think what's interesting about drones in terms of an ethical orientation towards technology is that they point to the way where it's important to make sure that you know what the ethical issues actually are with the technology, and then that you make sure that those are addressed in mainstream discourse about that technology. So, for example, with the drones, I think a lot of the reason that people on a base level end up concerned about them is that they evoke these scary sci-fi futures. So, for example, The Guardian quotes a British Ministry of Defense Eternal study from 2011, and it says that the report warns of the dangers of an incremental and involuntary journey towards a Terminator-like reality, referring to the movie, and then the report talks about the need to establish a policy on what will constitute acceptable machine behavior when you're talking about drones. And it's just sort of this hilarious irony that the Ministry of Defense, which is contracting these things and making these things, is then putting all the ethical concern onto what the technology will become, as if the technology is outside of their control. And it's as if it's the drone that is behaving, as opposed to the military or the state or the pilot in the bunker in Nevada. Well, I guess this is in Britain, this particular study, so that would be in Scotland, I guess. But the idea that these drones aren't scary because they're going to be the Terminator. These drones are scary because of the pre-existing human structures of oppression and domination and imperialism that they enable. In 2001, there was a US Senator, John Warren, who pushed in the National Defense Administration Act of that year to make sure that 1/3 of aerial strike vehicles would be remote controlled by 2010, and this didn't have anything to do with robotics at the time. What was possible, it had to do with his fear that if you had too many body bags coming home, America wouldn't be able to have a muscular foreign policy. So it just goes to what Jay Springer was saying earlier, that technology internalizes ideology, and drones are a really good example of that. And it's very important when you're getting excited about or when people get excited about drones, doing aid drops or whatever, that you bring that up. Adam and I in October got to go to the Drones, Aerial, and Robotics Conference at NYU, which is a very interesting experience. But there was a journalist there named Madiha Tahir who gave a very interesting talk, and she pointed out how it's problematic if you are having a conference and you're talking about the parrot drones flying around, the cute little quadcopters in the same sentence as you're talking about predator drones. What she says is that it's problematic that all of these kinds of technologies are being spoken of in one breath, because what that, I think, does is actually normalize the ideas that are behind the military uses of this technology, which have to do with surveillance, which have to do with displacing risk and only exposing certain types of people to harm. So that if you are going to hear mainstream discourses about drones, it is important to bring up what they're being used to do. And I want to transition into, if you can bring up the Google drone image. Yeah. So I think a lot of us are on the same page about the military-industrial complex, and it's kind of easy to see the Predator drones as scary, but I think it's also important to point out the danger of the Google drones as well. They're these beautiful solar-powered things that they just bought. They fly at really high altitudes. And the Google CEO, when it was talking about this, they have this very utopian view. It says, Titan Aerospace, which is the company they bought that makes these drones, and Google share a profound optimism about the potential for technology to improve the world. Google said, it's still in the early days, but atmospheric satellites could bring internet access to millions of people and help solve other problems, including disaster relief and environmental damage like deforestation. But it's important to go beyond that kind of techno-utopian line and realize that these are going to be flying 60,000 to 70,000 feet above the Earth, and the FAA only regulates up to 60,000 feet, which means that Google would literally be above the law. And it's important to question whether or not we really want Google above the law. So it's important to question the kind of softer imperialism that's been said before today of these technological companies, in addition to the harder imperialism of the military.
So I come at a lot of this stuff from the perspective of a tool maker and someone who builds systems, not aerial robotic attack systems normally. But and I think that the interesting part of the drone, and this is kind of mirroring what James has said, is not the hardware. It's that this represents an effector reaching out into the world from an algorithmic structure that is attempting to control the world for some reason. And this is not necessarily a good thing, this is not necessarily a bad thing, this is just a thing. And we are, as a culture, as a species, really new to thinking about the ethics and politics of algorithms as a way to restructure society. And I think that it's probably more interesting. I mean, again, the drones become a very obvious symbol of that, because they do let you, they are this charismatic megafauna. But the analytics pipeline that drives the drone, not the command and control pipeline, because this is just, this is a big radio. And, okay, it's running over fiber, it's running over a lot of different layers of technology, and scale does make a difference there. But I think that if you look at the signature strike stuff, what the JTRIG group inside GCHQ is doing as far as modeling cultural norms and radicalization, and attempting to detect and understand and shape the process of radicalization or political action in general, we're in a moment where this stuff is still visible because it's clumsy, because you need, this great big thing with a Hellfire missile, that's the pointy end. As that gets smaller and more precise, it becomes less visible. In the same way that the kind of Facebook-driven pro-democracy nudge campaign is actually really problematic, because it's like, well, who's to say that voting is actually the right end? Who's to say, certainly, that voting in any one direction or another is the right end? That's, but what you're actually talking about here is an algorithmic structure of social control, and not even with a single intent or there's no single sociality, there's no single algorithm, there's no single structure. It's this competing algorithmic soup where humans become, and human will becomes less and less important and relevant to the overall structure, or certainly the will of the humans who are being acted on. And I think when we see the drone, that's actually what we're seeing, is we're seeing one little claw sticking out of that big, muddy soup bin of algorithms.
I'm glad you brought up algorithms, because I think something that's a real interesting question for me about drones is like, what is the Reaper drone, the military drones, what is the Google drone here, this solar-powered experimental aircraft, and then what is a Parrot, which is a $300 smartphone toy? What are we call all these drones, but what do they actually have in common? And if you ask people who fly quadcopters, they say, oh, I have nothing to do with the military. That's not what I'm doing. I fly quadcopters. They're completely different things. And they are completely different things from one perspective, but then another perspective, what we're actually talking about with drones is we're talking about the spread of automation technologies and the spread of algorithmic data collection. And that's what's really going on here that is so interesting and perhaps also frightening at the same time. And so when we talk about drones, and we talk about how we can use drones for good purposes rather than use them for military purposes, if that's the sort of ethical framework we're approaching with, we're talking about how can we take something that is, by its very development, developed to be a military tool for collecting and processing data for the purposes of military control, and how can we turn that into something else, which is a difficult question, and I'll maybe pass the mic back here.
Okay. These little guys, who are, I think, equally creepy. I just like the whole thing, and I totally disavow the idea that you can kind of separate the technologies because they have exactly the same effects. The main thing that a drone allows you to do, whatever shape or size it is, it basically allows sight and action at a distance. It's just an extension of a network. It does the same. It's why it's like the internet, or why the internet is like a drone. It allows you to kind of reach out in this way, but very specifically, it allows you to do it from up here above. And we all know what happens when that happens. The very first unmanned aerial vehicles, first unmanned aerial weapons was the Russian attack on Venice in like 1790 when they floated balloons, hopefully in the direction of Venice. Actually, the wind blew them back. It was, it started well, UAV warfare. But the history of all aerial stuff is the history of weaponization. From the first use of hot air balloons in France, they immediately then turns to the American Civil War, and they're used for surveillance, and the first bombs are dropped from balloons shortly after that. The same with the history of flight, which received its kind of great boost in the First World War. Again, planes were intended just to be used for observation. That was the first intention of military aviation. And then, of course, you're up there and you look down and you go, oh, hey, I might as well drop a bomb now that I'm up here. And that's because these are technologies of surveillance and oversight, and those platforms are always weaponized eventually, even if that weaponization is something slightly more, again, because it's contemporary technology, kind of occluded. And it still might be a surveillance thing that is hooked up to a system of kind of discipline and punishment, or whatever it is. So I think it's really important to keep that conversation. I was at that Drones and Aerial Robotics conference as well, and it was really weird because the guys who fly these things, they really didn't want to talk about the military ones, as we've heard. And it's so important to keep doing so because of this thing, because the effects of them are the same, and because these raise the same issues. I think it's also really important as well, and I will talk a bit about this in the art context, though I always feel I'm sort of doing the art bit by accident, is that there's a lot of works that people make with these that just reproduce the same frightening effects. They don't question it or interrogate it in any way. I think it's very, very hard to kind of repurpose these things in a critical way. I don't see many works that actually do much with them. There was a lovely project by Alex Rivera called The Low Drone. Alex Rivera does a lot of work about the US-Mexico border and context of citizenship and various things. He made this was almost 10 years ago now or something, a really serious precursor project. He made a quadricopter that wasn't a surveillance thing. It was just an RC copter tricked out to look like a lowrider, kind of Latino lowrider, and then he flew it backwards and forwards across the US-Mexico border. That's nice, because what's going on there is you're pointing out the ways in which the drone kind of traverses this space and has the privilege to do so in the way that kind of ordinary humans don't. And there's a thing in there as well about how what these things do is they, not only is the politics kind of embodied in the technology, it's kind of freighted by them, right? So it transfers that politics and particularly geopolitics from place to place. So you get a technology which was largely developed to police and surveil the occupied territories, spreading out across the globe from Israel and Palestine to other contexts as well. And first of all, you get essentially the Palestinianization of Iraq, this kind of process by which that battlefield is turned into a replica of another context. And that is now spreading back again. So when you see drones increasingly being used on the border by both the Border Patrol in the US, the EU's trying to buy them, Australia's doing really terrible fucking things with them, you can kind of follow the drone around the world to see a succession of terrible things happening because it takes those terrible things with it where it goes, because that's the intentionality that's been built into that technology. That was a bit of a rant. Okay.
Well, I just I wanted to comment a little bit on this issue of the parrot copters and these kind of hobby drones, especially since there is going to be more and more commercial development and use of drones. The FAA was supposed to open airspace to commercial drones by 2015, but it's saying it's not quite going to be able to meet the deadline. But with these parrot copters, I think one of the concerns is that as they become something that you can just buy and use, that instead of kind of democratizing that technology, instead what it's going to do is turn just individual hobbyists into sort of mini, like their own personal police force, or their own personal CIA. There was just, at the same aerial and robotics conference, there was a CEO of DJI North America, which calls itself the global leader in unmanned aerial system design, specifically for photo and video applications. And he was just showing off this little quadcopter that you could hook up to your smartphone, so you could take video while you were flying it and show the video, and it's all very just supposed to be fun. But the way that he was speaking, he was so unaware of his racial and gendered biases and the logic that is then being embodied in this technology. He talked about making he wanted to call it a flying camera, not a drone. He talked about making it white instead of black to make it less threatening. And when there were questions about, the use of these for stalking, whenever he was talking about the potential stalking victim, he was using the female pronoun. There's just all of these, all these, sexism and racism, all of that gets embodied in the technology, not just on the military or large corporate level, but on the small scale. And so it is important to think about, as people start playing with these, are they playing with these in a way that is just reproducing the logic of the state and the corporation on a smaller level? Or are they playing them in a way that's really transformative? And I agree, it's kind of hard to figure out, what would be a very transformative way to play with these technologies. It's a really good question to think about. But
can you put up the DARPA thing?
I'm sorry, which one?
The smart bullet.
Oh, sure.
So this is a drone. This is a 50 caliber rifle round that's been fired downrange with guidance fins on it and an LED strap to the back of it. So we're in a really interesting moment, and I think the intersection between the parrots and the predators and this thing really point at that moment, because one of the reasons why we can sit here and have this conversation is that drones are visible. And that is a temporary condition. And I think that you've seen there's the Raven, which is one of the hand-launched ones, which has been used in Afghanistan fairly extensively. There are that's still just a camera drone right now, but it's very quickly going to get to be, well, okay, it's got 5 rounds of a 9mm strapped to it, and you can throw it over the fence and have it shoot someone. And as these things get smaller and smaller, DoD has hummingbird-sized drones that they're testing, that they're playing around with and that kind of thing. It's going to get more difficult to see these as the end effectors of this giant system, and that is going to vanish. And in the same way, I think, with that scale, with some of the parrots, the thing that we miss, and I actually do think that there is a distinct difference in some ways between the hobbyist drones and the military drones, because the hobbyist drones are isolated. They, yes, they self-stabilize, they have some algorithmic components, but they don't exist in the scope of this analytics network, in the scope of this data gathering network. And they never will, because the analytics network that is amenable to hobbyists, what you can build as a hobbyist, doesn't mean the same thing and can never mean the same thing, even if you have a little tiny bit of lethal force to strap to it, because of how networks scale and because of how algorithmic social control scales. In the same way that if I have, one individual, if I have if I have Adam's Facebook clickstream, it doesn't do me any good. Unless, I can look at what Adam likes on Facebook. Maybe that's going to be interesting.
I don't actually have a Facebook.
I know, but, and if I have all of the Facebook clickstreams in the world, well, personally, I don't have 15 petabytes a day worth of rack to shove them into. I can't do anything with them. But, if I'm an entity the size of Facebook, then that is very heavily monetizable data. And so this is, that scale disconnect is where we have the disjunction in meaning. And one of the problems has been for the reason why we can see this now with the drones, when the analytics network isn't that new. It's growing quickly, but it has existed. In some ways it's too big. In the same way that the drones are getting too small, the analytics networks are getting too big to see. And I also think that there's a distinct difference in agency where right now, yes, most of these things are remotely piloted. Certainly the parrots are going to continue being mostly remotely piloted for a good while. The development of actually autonomous weapons platforms is an entirely different issue. And that's something that we're certainly seeing, a growing worry about in the international relations community, in the international human rights community. There's a UN-affiliated group, the Campaign to Stop Killer Robots, which is looking at trying to establish guidelines on how autonomous you can be. How autonomous is it okay for something that kills someone to be? Do we want to establish, is it only ethical if we're killed by humans? Does that matter? Is that better?
Can you work up a photo of the drone shadow? Because I was actually just about to start talking about the Campaign to Stop Killer Robots, so I've been spiked, which is good because I'll talk about them anyway, because it's really good. I've been talking to them as well, and as Alice said, they have a brilliant, awesome name, and they're worth following, but they're also deeply, deeply serious. The Campaign to Stop Killer Robots is it's this vast NGO coalition, but crucially, it's the same guys who got all and girls, same people, same groups that got all the landmines and cluster munitions stuff passed, right? They spent like 10 years getting that stuff at a really high international level through. They got chops. That's hard, solid work with very real results. And now they're trying to do the same thing for this autonomous system stuff. And there's two parts to that. There's this kind of conceptualizing exactly how those groups would form. Like how you make rules about this stuff. There's also like how you get people on board, which is really, really crucial. I've been doing these installations for a while. These shadows of the drones, they're one-to-one outlines of the drone, and you just paint it out or chalk it out or whatever. And I've done them around the world. And if you want to go, yeah, that one's in DC. That was good. There's full instructions on my website if anyone else wants to do them. It's pretty simple. But the point is, this isn't what the Campaign to Stop Killer Robots needs. When they were doing the landmine and cluster munitions thing, tragically, horribly, there's some very, very effective imagery you can use in that campaign, because you can point to this is the result and this is what it looks like and all that kind of stuff. When we're talking about these invisible network systems, there's no thing to point at. We still haven't figured out how to draw a picture of the network, other than by the stupid cloud thing, which we all hate. So until we figure out better associative metaphors for talking about stuff, it's really hard to take ethical kind of positions on this and to discuss it fully, which is crucial if we're to have any kind of agency in the discussion. We still need those better kind of designs and distinctions for it. But there's one thing I want to throw out quite early on as well, is also this thing that, we keep talking about this invisibility, which is it's deliberate and it's tactical in the way that these things are deployed. It's also a function of the thing that is being deployed as a technology. It sort of veils itself behind just simply kind of technical knowledge. You need specialized technical knowledge to understand a lot of this stuff. But the flip side to all of that doom talk is we have unparalleled access to this stuff in terms of actual human history. Because the fact that this stuff has to get reified as a technology means that it has to be written down, right? It has to be made explicit in ways that power didn't necessarily have to be explicit in the past. It could remain far more hidden, in fact, than it can do now, because technology makes this thing explicit if we figure out quite exactly how to read it.
So this has all been great stuff, especially getting at the underside of what the tech is behind the drone. And a direction I kind of wanted to push the conversation in is to talk about, okay, so something that we do a lot when we study technology, study the web, Twitter, all these things, we're wondering how can these things be reappropriated? People from our kind of our perspective, where we're sort of fighting these battles against this sort of overwhelming power. If we have something that came directly out of the military-industrial complex, like the drone, how do we make it look less like a weapon? And I've been thinking about the sort of statement of swords to plowshares, which isn't quite as popular as it used to be. But this used to be sort of thrown out a lot as a justification for military spending. It's like, oh, great, these technologies will then trickle down to civilian use. But swords to plowshares, to turn a sword into a plowshare, you have to literally beat the shape out of the weapon until it returns to a raw material, and then you can reform it into something entirely different. So I kind of wanted to, and maybe to put this over to Olivia to talk about drone fiction a little bit. Something that's interesting about the drone is that we have these technologies which are kind of nefarious, but we also have the shape, and this kind of got at what James was saying earlier about the ability to sort of do art in a positive way. Like what is a good reappropriation of the drone? What is special about the drone that we can use and repurpose for these education, these sorts of political purposes, as opposed to just sort of continuing the cycle, sort of just feeding into the image of what a drone is. So Olivia, would you like to?
Oh, sure. I guess my experience with this is less with, trying to way to hack drones themselves, but more in terms of artistic representations of the drone and how to do that in a way that is adding new questions. So Adam and I last June curated Murmuration, which was an online festival of drone culture. And we had a piece of art or fiction or a lot of music actually, which was really cool. Posted on the Tumblr a day for the month of June. And if you want to bring up the My Little Droney.
Yeah. One of the favorite ones. Yeah, here it is.
So I think this is great because this was done by Christopher F. Smith was the artist behind this. And this is great because, first of all, it's a perfect parody. You don't really need to explain it very much. But it works well as sort of the fear of, if you do drone art, what you could be unironically if you are not careful, is that you don't actually want to be My Little Droney, right? You don't want to be like that video that goes around of the little drones playing the 007 theme song, and they all look cute, but it still kind of has that military propaganda aspect because they are playing this kind of martial song that is associated with these, kind of imperialist action figures. This is great because it is kind of poking fun at that and at the propaganda aspects of the drone, and also kind of making fun of the drone. And what Adam and I talked about, was having a festival, was kind of this carnival, this carnivalesque kind of idea of taking the drone and kind of making it silly and making it strange and kind of demystifying it and then bringing up questions about it. And in terms of the curation of the festival itself, we tried to balance things like, if you have the Shakira portrait that Molly Crabapple did.
Yeah. Sorry, it's not very high.
This is this very moving little sketch that Molly Crabapple did of Shakira, who was a 4-year-old girl who was killed by a drone strike in Pakistan. So we tried to balance art that really brought home the impact of the drone strikes, because it sounds kind of abstract. You can't always get the names of everybody who was killed. They talk about enemy combatants when really they just mean any man of military age. So it was, to make that not abstract, to make that specific and concrete, which is something that fiction and art can do. So we were trying to do things like that, and then we also had images like if you wanted to bring up the day in the life, the drone in the doctor's office one.
This was done by Colin Morse, was the artist behind this one, and so this is the kind of thing that kind of demystifies the drone. I don't think it's necessarily glamorizing it because it's kind of in this vulnerable position, but just showing this is just a technology and have different creative ways to think about the drone. So that was sort of the idea behind the festival, and I do think that, you know, that is, but there's always going to be a tension with art. To what extent does representation equal endorsement? And if you wanted to, this was not something from Murmuration, but if you wanted to bring up the sort of Pakistani truck drone art images. This is done by an artist, a Pakistani woman named Malwish Christie or Chisti. I might be pronouncing that horribly. I read this online. But she was doing these drone art, which is based on the art that people in Pakistan will use to decorate trucks. And she was asked by Mother Jones in an interview, you know, some people might see this as a positive spin on drones, and she was saying, I don't know if I'm glorifying it, I just wanted people to talk about it. At the same time, it has some kind of beauty to it. I am also looking at them as objects and not so much as war machines. And I think it does matter that, you know, she's a Pakistani woman, so for her to take what are symbols of death in her country and to turn them into something beautiful does kind of look like a reappropriation, whereas if an American artist did the similar thing, it might end up looking or reading differently. But there is also the issue that when you're doing art about anything, there does have to be room to play, and that, you know, there is always a risk that your play will be misinterpreted. So that's what I wanted to, if you wanted to add anything about Murmuration.
No, you could, Ellis.
So there's a question on Twitter about how new it is to use agency or to use algorithms to govern society, with the referent being pointed at things like town planning and that kind of thing, and these, you know, procedural structures that we've used to you know, started to use to govern the way we live, you know, certainly starting with the Enlightenment and you know, and probably in many cases going back much further. And I think that there is a distinct difference between algorithms that are socially performed by a collective of humans and algorithms that are performed automatically. They become a different category of entity. And even if you have, and this gets to the question of like how much human will has to be, you know, how much human will makes killing someone in combat okay. You know, if that question is what it ends up hinging on, you know, you can very easily, as these analytic systems get more and more complicated, imagine a situation where the analytic system does all of the evaluation and the trade-offs and that kind of thing, and then you've just got, you know, I mean, if you imagine it's like, what's Tinder, one of the you know, kind of hot or not sort of things, and you get presented with a screen full of context, you know, context about who this person is and what their life is and all of this kind of stuff, and there's just a human kind of kill, save. Like, is that a non-autonomous weapon system? You know, is that a sufficient degree of human judgment? There's been a certain amount, one of the other points of visibility with drones has been the drone operator's role, and that, you know, there's been all of these stories about, oh my God, these guys are getting all this PTSD, it's terrible, which is, I mean, kind of ridiculous. I think there was the number, like 92% of people in Yemen are currently estimated to have PTSD from the level of drone operations that have been sustained in this country. You know, so I think in a large degree that is entirely, you know, seeing the wrong end of the stick. But I do think that it's interesting because in both cases, there is a dislocation which is part of the trauma. The fact that it is happening at a distance changes the psychological impact both of the fear and of the of what it means to be creating that violence. Anytime you're interacting with this kind of condition at a remote, this happens. In hacktivist circles, this is something that we saw. We had a bunch of folks who were doing ground handling operations, working with people in Syria, giving communication support and various things like that. And, you know, of course, their contacts eventually, you know, a lot of them drop off and they don't, you know, and maybe it's 2 or 3 days and then somebody pops on IRC again and it's like, oh, sorry, I got really busy, I got caught up in whatever, I couldn't make it to channel, and maybe they don't, and you don't find out more about that. And we started seeing, combat stress and the same kind of PTSD in the people who were doing this work. In no small part because they don't have any of the psychological cues around them that tell them this is a thing that is happening that's real in the world. It's not just your imagination and this little black box of text. And that dislocation really changes our ability to handle it psychologically. So I think as we see this stuff spreading and as we see these kinds of effectors in automation becoming more and more prevalent and a larger and larger part of the structures of control that are used as astroturfing systems and sock puppets and all of these other technologies in terms of cultural manipulation become more a thing that we have to deal with on an everyday basis. I ask myself sometimes when I'm interacting with people on Twitter, and sometimes I ask them, like, are you a real human being or are you someone's sock puppet intended to represent a certain point of political view in an argument? And that's the same part and parcel of that kind of cultural response. It's just another endpoint.
All right, well, we want to get to questions soon, but I do want to put one question to the panel before we do that. And it's a question that I think we often come back to in this conversation because it's one that, there's a lot to get to in it. And that's, what do we do with the semiotics of this? I mean, the word drone itself is incredibly loaded, but so is the term unmanned aerial vehicle. So, what do we actually do with the semiotic culture that we are building and that is being constructed around this, this particular kind of technology?
The name of drone is really interesting. If you aren't already aware, so the military will not use the word drone in any of their official communications. They prefer one of these alphabet soup acronyms like UAV, UAS, RPV, all these different abbreviations that kind of get away from this connotation of the word drone. However, drone seems to have stuck. It's a word that the public likes. It's a word that the media likes. It works for a lot of different reasons, but mostly I think it's about keeping this single image, this sort of this symbol that is not not necessarily as complex as it should be technologically. The difference between a remotely piloted vehicle and an unmanned aerial system might be, a good technological distinction to make at a certain level of criticism, but I think in a public sense, in a more popular sense, we kind of like this distinction. I want to grab a picture here. I'm sorry for the dead air just for a second as I track this down. Here we go. So this is a drone effigy that you will see at a lot of protests. This is from Dark last October. There was a teach-in going on outside the conference, and the people running the teach-in had brought their model drone. And there are companies that actually make these model drones to sell to protesters. And it's very rare, at least in the United States. This one they made themselves. I don't want to disparage their craftsmanship here because it was quite well made. I was talking to the fellow who made it with his friend. But it's very rare if you go to an anti-war protest these days that you will not see one of these drones carted along on wheels, as you might be able to see on a tripod, almost like some sort of a religious icon, almost like an effigy that is, and it's, if you look at anti-war protesting and you look at sort of the anti-drone protesting, they come from a similar place, but there's this kind of focus and fixation on drones themselves as if the war would end if there were no drones, which of course is not really the case. So there's something here to this symbol that I think is kind of overwhelming, that we've latched onto it, and that kind of takes us back to the image in the beginning of that canonical drone, that fake rendering. But I will pass the mic on.
Thanks. Can you put up the Pakistan protest image?
Yeah.
I think you've got that. Yeah, I mean, what Adam just pointed out is this thing that we keep circling around as well, is just how limiting addressing the object of the drone itself as. But I still like this image. very much. I have a whole collection of these. These particularly, yeah. So here you go. This is the picture of that effigy essentially being burned, which is significant. I think it's a powerful image, because every time we see technology being kind of burned in effigy or destroyed in some way, it points to a really fundamental truth of the technologies. And for me, it always takes me back essentially to the Levellers, who are kind of a 17th century English social movement in the north of England who smashed the looms of the early factories because they were taking their jobs, essentially. And Luddite is that word that's now come to mean anyone who's kind of reflexively, knee-jerkingly against technology. But it doesn't mean that. It means a social movement. People are deeply concerned about the social effects of technology themselves, and I think that's really, really key to kind of point out in these terms of these images. Can you put up the other one of the global hawk arriving at the airbase?
Oh, yeah.
You know that one, so I can't remember what it's called. But there's Adam mentioned the alphabet soup of names, which are kind of crazy. The drone is this kind of widely used term, but then the technical term tends to be UAV, unmanned air vehicle, or UCAV in the terms of kind of predators, unmanned combat air vehicle if it's armed. But the militaries, particularly, this is where you start to fall into weird distinctions between our air forces and armies and stuff. But air forces tend to always prefer RPA, which is remotely piloted aircraft, because it means the pilot's still like a thing, and he gets to wear his wings and like his shiny hat. And but the drone aspect of that kind of is basically still this. It's still us trying to figure out how we respond to this. This is a picture of a drone having a homecoming parade. Seriously, this is a picture it's an official Air Force picture of Global Hawk airframe number whatever, returning home to base after successful missions in Iraq and Afghanistan, and they bring out the fire hoses and they give it a parade, which is insane. But it points to our kind of deep, like, trying to work out what is happening here. And the point I was trying to remember I was trying to make is that one coming back to this idea of the unmanned aerial vehicle. There is something that unmans about this thing. For male people, which is a large chunk of the armed forces, there is something deeply unpleasant about that concept as well, and I think it speaks to that, the discomfort, even within armed forces, of the use of these kind of weapons. There is something unmanning about them. And you get into this, and I haven't gone nearly into enough of this, but there's really interesting things, I think, about that you can read into the kind of gendering or anthropomorphization of the drone. This is definitely an anthropomorphized image, an anthropomorphized plane, in the way that the protesters kind of, I think, successfully managed to not anthropomorphize it. But we don't tend to anthropomorphize the drone very much. The one kind of particular gendering example I have is the name that they use for the drones in Palestine, where Israeli drones are flying overhead most of the time, and that's Zenana, which is like in English, it's an onomatopoeia. One of the roots of the word drone is this onomatopoeia term of something droning on. That's the same. That's basically the same version as that's what Zenana is. It's kind of it's the sound of the drone. But Zenana in Palestine also has this connotation of basically a nagging wife. Essentially, it's so it has this slightly gendered term, but the drone is never, apart from sort of in that context, is never a she, like other kind of ships and planes and stuff. And again, it's because it doesn't fulfill the roles that we would apply to kind of a ship as being both like a safe haven for sailors and airmen or whatever, for themselves, and also, sorry to be crude, but something that is ridden, which is the origin of that term. And without those kind of cues for it, we can't quite anthropomorphize it. We can't talk about it in that same way. We have to kind of continually relegate it to the condition of a technology, which means that I think we will always remain kind of incapable of bringing it into the discourse in the way that we have other weapons, other technologies in some ways, because we can't name this thing. We are fundamentally, as a species, keeping it at arm's length, and I think really a series of very interesting ways.
just want to say quickly that I actually really like the term drone, specifically because it annoys the industry and the military people. Apparently, when the Association for Unmanned Vehicle Systems, it's like the lobbyist group, they had their trade show in Washington, D.C., and the Wi-Fi password for the press room was "Don't say drone." So I kind of like it because of that it's almost this sort of collective hack that has just come up that people keep using because they're uncomfortable with these things, and they're letting the people who are building them and flying them know that they're uncomfortable by continuing to call it that, not on a conscious level, but on an unconscious level. I also, wanted to point out how problematic it is to use these kind of autonomous or unmanned terms when talking about the remotely piloted planes, because they're not unmanned or autonomous. They are piloted by someone. It's just that person is not up in the plane itself. They're in Nevada or wherever it is. And actually, Nathan Jurgensen wrote a very good essay about that for Memoration called The Fiction of the Autonomous Drone. I wanted to give a shout out to that. But that is an important issue. To call things autonomous when they're not kind of absolves the human pilot of responsibility. It absolves the government that made the drones and sent them over from responsibility, and it's important not to do that linguistically. And of course, it's obvious why the military would want to do that linguistically. But I also wanted to talk briefly just about, the word drone itself and the other meanings for that word and how they can kind of subvert the meaning of the technology. For Memoration, like I said, we got a lot of musical submissions, which is really fascinating, and a lot of them actually took the form of musical drones. Especially there was one that we commissioned from Jace Clayton, DJ Rupture, who has this series of musical apps that you can download called Sufi plugins, which are supposed to express like non-Western ideas of sound. And one of those apps is a drone, and he did sort of an improvisation using that app for Memoration. But he had some really interesting things to say about it that I just wanted to read. So he talks about, attack, decay, sustain, release. These words comprise ADSR envelope, a way to describe how sound, specifically musical instruments, unfold in time. The initial moments of attack and decay contain what our ears interpret as the character of any given noise. Drones are what happens when sounds unite around the idea of sustain. The sound wave's entrance and exit points lessen in importance, allowing subtler aspects of audio identity to emerge. Narratives of newness drive both pop music and the avant-garde drones suggest narratives of newness drive both pop music and the avant-garde. Drones suggest alternatives to these motivations. Unlocked and immediate, audio drones resist narrativization. Yet the story they tell is one of singularity, optimism, and slowness. This now, this being in space. Your body listening or sound itself as body. It's a sustained rebuke to the macho tech-driven boisterism, the thrill of the new plus the thrill of remote control, that makes their flying homonyms appear inevitable and one well worth listening to. So I just like that idea that one meaning of the word drone could kind of subvert the meaning of drone as these planes that you see up here.
So I just have a short question. So we've talked about the semiotics of the flying drone, but the big dog seems to be doing something very, very different. That we anthropomorphize just fine. And so it's not fielded yet. We don't understand what that is going to mean in the same way. And I think it will end up, as an infantry technology, it will probably end up being fielded at much greater scale. And of course, we definitely don't know what they mean once they become autonomous and armed. But I wonder, especially if James, if you've got any thoughts on where that's going to end up driving that kind of signifier, because we don't think to call those drones.
Say that again.
We don't think to call those drones.
Which
the big dogs?
The big dogs, yeah. The big dogs, for those who don't know, those things, which are also super terrifying. And if you've ever seen Pet Man, which is a humanoid version essentially, but just has a massive flashing red light for his head. It's kind of awful. We don't call the drones because they've been anthropomorphized to that kind of point, I think, essentially. The anthropomorphization of these things is always absolutely key, or in this case, kind of, petizing them, or whatever the term should be for creating these things an object. But actually, I think that like, I don't know why we don't call, you know, like subroutines on computer systems drones, where essentially anything that has some form of agency that is distinct from ours. And I think a lot of the unease about the agency of drones is where we assign agency within those systems. That's where it starts to get really, really complex. The danger of not just autonomous systems, but like the assemblages that we currently have of machinery and human operator, but also like the person who originally wrote the software that they're running on. Like, we're already living in a time when assigning agency to human actions is incredibly difficult, because it's not really sure exactly at what point, or who has like the full share of the intention of any action. If you're, you know, my example for this, to go into a different domain, is always in architecture. As in, if you walk around most contemporary Western cities today, you start to see a lot of buildings that weren't really designed by architects. I mean, they literally weren't designed by architects. They were designed by kind of developers or planners. But they were also basically designed by, you know, the guys at Autodesk who make the 3D visualization software, because there's so many details of that building which has been produced by kind of just drop-down menus. And that is the position that we kind of, I think, find ourselves in with so many of these as well, is these systems have become so large and so complex that we don't know where to assign agency, or in the case of warfare, blame or accountability, essentially, which are really important things. But again, as I always try and put nice glosses on these things, like, what this should be is, let's call it a teaching moment, of like a serious prod to make ourselves more comfortable, essentially with grey areas as well. I know I said how technology kind of makes a lot of these politics kind of explicit before, but I also think in order to deal with this stuff, in order to deal with these questions, we kind of have to become, we have to shape new forms of thinking that actually account for the fact that you can't assign this stuff into places like that. That actually, that a lot of the models we've had up to this point, which mean those things have to be assigned. You know, the entire body of human rights law, for example, that you have to have a single point at which you can address blame. That's not going to work anymore. And we desperately need new structures of thinking in huge amounts of stuff about like the world that these technologies is revealing to us, essentially.
Sorry, we should probably get to some questions in the 15 minutes or so we have left. First of all, do we have anything from Twitter?
There's tons from Twitter.
Oh my god, okay, well we can probably only do one or two, so can you pick like the best one?
Okay, well, there's been a lot of discussion on objects like model planes and other flying objects created by remote control hobbyists. Can you elaborate on the differences between these technologies and what where the line is drawn between drone and like remote control object?
The line is obviously very fuzzy, and that's part of the problem and what we're talking about. The very first successful military drones were they were called lightning bugs, is what they were called. They were developed from a targeting drone. Let me grab a picture right here. There, so you can see it's launched off the wing of a DC-130 right there. These were around in the Vietnam War, and they were used for reconnaissance. They were pre-programmed, and then they are jet-powered. They would fly over Southeast Asia, over China and Vietnam, and they would take photos, and then they would go back out to sea and deploy a parachute, and then be snatched out of the air by a helicopter. And these were actually the first successful drones that weren't used for targets. But they weren't remotely operated. They were all pre-programmed. They couldn't be steered once they had been released. And yet they sort of fulfill that drone function. They fulfill that sort of automated data collection function. They would do things as complicated as electronic warfare. They would do jamming. They would pick up electronics intelligence. They even wired one up to actually fire a missile from the drone, but their video technology wasn't good enough to aim the target very well. But it worked. So as technology changes, as technology advances, we're seeing the drone sort of take these different shapes, but I think what we're looking at here is this sort of use of automation to enable data collection and enable sort of tactical mission strategies in ways that weren't previously used. And that's why I think these other technologies, like one more image real quick. So this is an aerostat, which is a balloon. It's one of the simplest flying machines around, but this is used by the Border Patrol as well. It has over-the-horizon radar. They can track people just like they can with drones, even though it's tethered to the ground. It doesn't move around. It's just a big bag of gas that floats in the air. So I think it's the function is what we're looking at. I think.
All right, how about from the audience? If you want to ask a question, can you actually line up in front of that microphone so that we can hear you for the live stream? Anybody have anything from the audience?
So that was really great, thank you. I was really interested to hear what you all thought about the sort of Silicon Valley's role in this so far. So what's the danger of corporates like Facebook and Amazon starting to rebrand that? And will that sort of techno-optimism then change society's views on all of this in a positive way? And from a meta?
I'd say quickly two things about that. The first of it is that Silicon Valley emerges from militarism entirely. I mean, that's why Silicon Valley where it is because of the military history of Central California and the military industries there. And actually, pretty much the best drone artwork of all time, and a seriously kind of foundational one, is the BIT plane by the Bureau of Investigative Technology. I can't remember what BIT stands for. It's like Natalie Jeremy Jenko et al. From some years ago, where they actually flew a little remote control plane kind of through the controlled airspace of Silicon Valley, looking down on all these kind of defense firms on Raytheon or whatever it was kind of then. The effect of Silicon Valley getting to this stuff, as we've heard with the kind of Google plane, is this normalizing kind of effect of the weirdnesses. The Amazon delivery thing is just bloody terrifying. The idea that we all want kind of swarms of basically assemblages of flying blades flying around over at head height. Well, we know this is publicity, just as we know the Google Wi-Fi from drone stuff is pure publicity. There's a lot better ways to get networking into these places than flying planes. So yeah, it's distraction. It's your pretty much your standard old military industrial complex chaff in the wind to distract us from the kind of essential things that are going on here and try to look cool.
I think the other thing I'd put there as far as the interaction between Silicon Valley and the drone is that if we remember that the drone is the entire analytics network, that analytics network is built on the business model of Silicon Valley. The information that allows the drone to target would not exist in an analyzable and targetable way. The drone would be blind, not from its video cameras. It would be blind from its socio-perceptive cortex, whatever the fuck you want to call that giant, massive surveillance grid, right? It should maybe not be the campaign to stop killer networks. It should be the campaign, or not the campaign to stop killer robots, but the campaign to stop killer networks. So yeah, no, I think these two are intimately related.
Yeah, I was wondering, could you bring up the Jordan Worley in this sign Conquer image? So this was another Murmuration contribution by an artist named Jordan Worley, and it was more about the military use of drones. It was about what had been an image of safety for the pilots has become a totem of death. It's based on the Constantine conversion. He sees a cross in the sky, and it says, "In this sign, conquer." And so a religion that is salvation for some people becomes death for other people, as Christianity becomes like an expansionist religion or an imperialist religion when Rome adopts it, essentially. And I think that there's a lot of this kind of messianic thing going on, an imperialist thing going on with the Google and the Facebook drones flying up high, giving internet to everybody, as if it's somehow altruistic for a company to try to get more people who could use it. And especially when the first report started to come out about, Facebook wanting to fly drones to bring internet to Africa specifically, and then it became the world. It wasn't hard to make these sort of like missionary imperialist comparisons. So that's definitely an element of it. That kind of conquering and messianic conquering works just as much for the Silicon Valley as it does for the military.
No.
If
Can I do drones? No.
Yeah, I just want to jump in on that real quick. Speaking of messianic complexes, I just want to throw up my favorite and least favorite drone slide ever. So this is by the Silicon Valley startup Matternet that wants to use drones for humanitarian purposes. Now, what is wrong with this slide? First of all, that's just a mock-up of a drone, which is clearly there for good because of the Red Cross. That's what the Red Cross means. To help unfortunate people. That's what dilapidated huts mean. Yeah, they give a lot of TED Talks, but they haven't really done any prototypes since 2012. So, yeah, messianic complexes indeed.
Yeah, did you give me a slide of Dronestogram? It doesn't really matter.
Which one, sir?
Dronestogram, which is another project of mine, which I just want to point out as basically to follow up on Ella's point about the common infrastructure on which these things are running, the same strata. One of my kind of obsessions with the drone is the fact that it is doing exactly the same things as all our nice fluffy social media are. It's just tuned towards secrecy and violence and surveillance rather than this kind of empathic notion that we're all sort of brought together by electronic communications. So this is a thing that I do, which is where I follow the reports of the Bureau of Investigative Journalism and the Long War Journal in the US, who report on covert drone strikes, find the locations of those strikes on publicly available digital maps, photograph them through those maps, and then post them back to social media, Instagram, Tumblr, Twitter, all this kind of stuff. But the point of that story is that the first comment anyone ever makes when they see the drone shadows, the big outlines on the ground, is like, oh, I had no idea it was so big. Which is like such a basic comment and so sort of banal, but also so brilliant and important because that's the thing, right? It's like the immediate next question is like, hang on, how the hell did I not know it was this big? Like, how is this thing that is so big invisible to me? And I knew so little about it, and then you move from there. First comment you always get on Instagram about Instagram is, I don't want to press like, but. Because it's the only kind of option available to you on this kind of thing. And immediately, because you change that kind of the way in which people are forced to engage with these services, you're questioning not only the kind of drone strikes as well, which I hope is kind of the major point, but you also the infrastructure of these services themselves and the political implications that are involved in them as well.
All right, I think we have time for one more question if it's a pretty quick one. Does anybody want to? Awesome.
So it does seem to me to be an error to focus entirely on the military application of drones, in that, drones are about to get really small, but they're probably about to get really huge too, and that we're going to have self-piloting Airbus A360s flying mahi-mahi from Hawaii and fresh lobster from Maine, and self-piloting ships at sea and self-piloting combines. And the first application of Google's self-driving car is going to be long-haul trucking. And that pretty soon there's going to be, the continuing emptying out of humans of the logistics network and that portion of the country that we call flyover territory. What is the role of drones in, the continuing intensification of capitalism and not just the military-industrial complex?
All right, you guys, you have to answer this in 30 seconds or less, each of you. Okay, go.
Just about like the commercial applications of drones, because this is something I've looked into a good deal, is there's some good ideas, but it's really unclear how a lot of them are going to function yet. The national airspace is really complicated, and drones are pretty simple, and their sense and avoid capabilities are very low. So I think a lot of these things, kind of end up looking more like the Matternet slide than they look really plausible as yet. But then, I think we've already talked plenty about the problems of collecting big data and allowing these automation forces out in the wild. So I'll cut down on that.
All right, well, if we're going to talk about automation and labour, then let's talk about Amazon drones, and not the flying blades, but the people who actually work in these factories, in the distribution centres. And let's be honest, the only reason Amazon still employs actual humans is we have reasonably manipulable joints, and we can bend down and go up, and we're quite fuel efficient. Because people who work in Amazon data centers, Amazon employs this thing called chaotic storage in their massive data centers, which means that stuff isn't stored like humans store it. It's stored randomly, but most efficiently, so that things that are different are actually quite close to each other when you're collecting them. That means the people who work in those places have to have little PDAs with them all the time that tell them where to go to find stuff, because you can't find it like a human. They are remotely piloted people, and they're being piloted by the technology, and that is how they are forced then to navigate that space. That space is also a control technology, because it allows them to be measured, how fast you're walking, how often you take toilet breaks, how long your lunch breaks are. So the automation, the self-driving nature, all these things, they are first and foremost, as Ella's pointed out, analytics platforms that are used to enforce behaviors or norms or whatever they are, wherever this kind of thing happens. And that's fine, it's good if we get lots of good, more efficiencies out of the system, but there are always people in it somewhere too.
I mean, I think if we want to talk about economic force projection, that's basically what you're looking at. You're looking at how we can depopulate labor, and if we, combine that with other systems that allow us to collectively determine what the goals of that infrastructure are, collectively determine what the ethics of that infrastructure are, and to redistribute the value from those systems, then yeah, these things may be great, but that needs to be baked into the fundamental systems and technologies that we're dealing with. You can't add freedom in later to a computer system. You cannot, just sort of set the, set the solidarity bit in a packet. It doesn't work that way. It has to be thought about from the very beginning. A very quick story, possibly to close with. So last year I spent a little bit of time talking to a bunch of the gray hairs who designed some of the first internet RFCs, and we spent a lot of time talking about politics, because this was after the Snowden releases. And they designed a lot of the core IP protocols with a very specific political mindset. Now, additional layers have been added on top of that and have changed the meaning of the network. But the basic tools that they built still mean roughly the same thing politically that they were intended to build from the first part. So this is both very hopeful for me as a tool maker and very depressing for me as someone who is a subject of other people's tool making, who's a subject of imperial technologies, that the politics that we build into these things will breed true. And I think that is almost even more relevant for economic systems and economic infrastructures than it is for military infrastructures.
All right, I want to thank the amazing panel. This has been absolutely fantastic. Thank you for the wonderful questions. Please check out the panelists' bios, check out their work, because everybody here is doing some amazing work if you want to continue this conversation. Thank you to our hashtag mod. And yeah, so the plenary is going to be here, so stick around for that. Thank you all very much. Yeah, that was awesome.